Welcome. As you probably just heard, we're recording this meeting. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars we're very excited about. It's in a program we're calling Gene-Based Diagnosis 101, How to Successfully Navigate the Diagnostic Journey. And our first tonight is specifically how to effectively partner with a genetic counselor and accelerate your rare diagnostic journey. We've had this program in the works for a while, and a lot of the Global Genes team has done some great work pulling together the information to make these resources and the people that can appear in panel discussions such as this. Next slide, please. The next 2 webinars in this series are August 17th and 31st. It's Diagnosis or No Diagnosis, What's Next? Finding your way through genetic testing to a diagnosis. And on the 31st, Making Decisions about Genetic Testing, Gene Therapy, and Clinical Trials, Weighing the Options. So I hope you can join for all 3 of those. I know on the 17th, we have each night we have great speakers, but on the 17th in particular, I'm looking forward to Gina Sejic from Rare Undiagnosed Network, Lorenzo Botto from Utah Health and the Penelope program, and Jessie Fine, a rare mom, who's a great speaker too. So next slide, please. Tonight, we're going to basically work through, I'll be introducing the panelists, then we'll have a panel discussion, the 3 of them. And in our last 20 minutes or so, we'll have question and answer. So please go ahead and while we might not get to the questions till the end, you can be asking them now if you want to enter them into the Q&A text field on your browser. That's great. We'll get to those questions at the end. And then we wrap up with some of the Global Genes resources and other resources available on this topic. Next slide, please. What you'll be learning in our presentation tonight is understanding the role of various genetic tests and different types of tests, whole exome, whole genome sequencing, different panels, and finding out how a genetic counselor can help you pursue gene-based diagnosis and why that matters. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm also a rare disease parent myself, and I thought I knew a bit about this process, and I've been learning a lot more through these people. So the material we're sharing tonight is based on a couple of new toolkits we'll be releasing. Following this presentation, we'll send you all an email with where to look for the 2 new toolkits we've just completed: genetic testing, getting to a diagnosis. We also have a genetic test comparison table. You'll see that in the presentation tonight. And the next toolkit, how a genetic counselor can help you. And then another sort of infographic 1-sheet questions you can ask your genetic counselor. So next slide, please. I'm thrilled to introduce our panel. And we have Allison Weisman, who's a genetic counselor at the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. She's also an assistant professor of pediatrics at Northwestern University. She's a passionate advocate for rare disease community in the state of Illinois and at a national level. Melissa Hayden is a patient advocate for those with rare diseases while living with her own rare disease, FKBP14 related Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. She hopes to bring awareness to the world of genetic testing for patients going through their own genetic diagnosis journey. And Eleanor Griffith is a certified and licensed genetic counselor and the founder of Gray Genetics, a telehealth genetic counseling and consulting company. So welcome to all of you. And for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Daniel DeFabio. I'm Global Genes Associate Director of Community Engagement. So glad to have you all with us tonight. Thank you. Next slide, please. We're going to get into the basics of what genetic testing is, what part of the genes are we looking at, and basically how and why does this all work, and where do people look when they're genetic testing. So I think Allison can get us started well with this topic. Allison?
Thank you, Daniel. I'm excited to be sharing today. So just so we're all on the same page, it's important to do a little Biology 101 refresh, make sure we all know what we're talking about when we discuss genetic testing and genetic counseling. So first, our entire bodies are made up of billions and trillions of cells, and inside of our cells are our genetic information, or our DNA. It's what tells us what we look like, how tall we are, how our bodies form and function. And it's really important to be balanced and working correctly. Any changes could impact our health and development. So that genetic information is arranged into chromosomes. You can see here on the screen, that's what those little X's look like. Those are our cartoon chromosomes. And we typically have 46 chromosomes in the cells of our body. They're organized into 23 pairs of 2, where we get 1 chromosome from each pair from our biological mother and 1 chromosome from each pair from our biological father. And if you unwind those chromosomes, you'll see our genetic information, or our DNA, which is made up of chemical letters. So on the left side, you can see the A's and the T's and the G's and the C's. Those are our chemical letters or chemical alphabet that make up our genes. And our genes, each one has a very specific job, and changes in those chemical letters or changes in the amount of information can impact our health. Next slide. So here is a great analogy for thinking about our genetic information. So if you want to think about your DNA as a book or the instruction manual, it has all of those key pieces of information that are important for us. We can break that book down, or break your genetic information down into chapters, where each chapter would be like the chromosome, the structure that holds those genes and that genetic information. And if you break that chapter down, each paragraph would represent a specific gene. And if you read each paragraph, there's going to be sentences that code for proteins and enzymes. And there's parts of the paragraph that don't code for the enzymes and proteins. And then further within those sentences, the individual words are like the amino acids that our chemical letters, that DNA alphabet, make up. And with genetic testing, we can analyze this book or this instruction manual to look for changes that could impact health and development. Next slide, please. So Global Genes has created a really fantastic toolkit that's an introduction to the various genetic testing technologies. And this is just one part of that toolkit, and there's going to be another slide with some additional information, but it's comparing the different tests to each other. So very briefly, I'm not going to read this all to you, but I think it's important to understand that there are differences between each type of test, and it's really important to work with your genetics provider to figure out which test is the appropriate test to order for yourself or your child, why, and what is the plan moving forward. Because for a lot of people, they need multiple genetic tests to get to a diagnosis if they're lucky to receive one. So first, FISH is a test that is sometimes ordered when we're looking for a very specific region of chromosomal material, so a very specific piece of chromosome material, and we want to know, is it present or absent? So it's sort of a yes/no answer about, is something there or not. Karyotype refers to your chromosomes. So if we look under a microscope and we do a chromosome analysis, we're looking at how many are there and are there any structural changes. That's again a descriptive test. Chromosomal microarray is going to look at the quantity of information. So it's looking at your chromosomes to see how much information is there. Are there any extra or missing pieces? For example, do we have paragraphs missing from our chapters, or do we have pages inserted into the book? Is there a difference in how much is there? It doesn't tell you what that information actually says or doesn't say. Targeted mutation analysis or targeted testing is when you're looking for something specific, whether that's a genetic change where there's one change in a gene that causes a specific disease, and you just want to know, is that change present or absent? Or someone else in the family has been diagnosed with a genetic condition, and you're looking for a yes/no answer. Did this individual inherit that genetic condition? Next slide, please. Single gene sequencing or single gene analysis is similar. It's a very targeted test. Usually it's when your provider has a specific condition in mind that they think may be occurring in yourself or your child, and they want to do targeted testing to see if we can find a change in that gene. In contrast, we also can look at multiple genes at once through multiple gene sequencing panels. This could be a handful of genes all the way up to hundreds or thousands of genes. It's more targeted where we can say, okay, we have an idea of what's going on, and we're going to cast a broader net than looking at one gene at a time, but we don't want to look at everything because we already have a good idea of potentially what type of genetic condition this could be, and that may be faster and more cost effective than ordering broader testing. If we've already done that type of testing, or we don't know where to start, we might order more broad comprehensive testing like whole exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing. The big difference between these two tests is that the exome contains the coding regions of your genes and the genome contains everything. So one test is going to be more specific, looking at the coding sections of genes, looking for changes that may impact how a gene functions, whereas whole genome is going to look at those regions plus in front of them and behind them and downstream, looking for any changes that may impact how those genes function. And it can also detect if there's changes in the amount of material present. So this isn't a perfect example, but it's sort of like combining whole exome and microarray. Again, not a perfect example, but a great way to think about, well, what can this find and what can't this find? Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Allison. I know there's a lot in those charts, and in this presentation format, they're probably a little too small to read. And that's why it's one of the links we're going to be sending everybody to tell you where you can get that chart as a bigger, more easily read one sheet document. So, but thank you for guiding us through it, so it's not as foreign when people actually do download the chart and read it themselves. And next, we want to talk about how people can partner with genetic counselors. And we have a great example of that with Melissa Hayden, especially since the genetic counselor she had partnered with was Allison. So Melissa, why don't you tell us how you ended up partnering with Allison?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And I'm very excited to be here. So as he said, I'm Melissa and I am 29 years old. And I used to be a patient of Allison's, who clearly is very smart and was very helpful for me. So I went 24 years without a diagnosis, and I had to learn to live with my symptoms just as they came up without knowing why. And thankfully, a few years after I met Allison, we found an answer and I was diagnosed with FKBP14 related Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I met Allison at Lurie Children's Hospital, and at first I was really not receptive to care. To be fair, I was a sassy teenager at that point, but for close to 20 years, I had been poked and prodded by the genetics department and never got any answers. And so for me, I selfishly felt like I wasn't getting anything out of it, and finally decided that I had had enough. So I walked away for a while, and thankfully Allison and my other doctors were more persistent, and she started meeting me at my cardiologist appointments. She continued to do this for a while, and she was always so positive and encouraging and brought new suggestions or test options to try to at least tell me what else was out there, what new things were coming out. There's new stuff every day. And all of this is key to any genetic counselor's role. But however, more importantly than that, Allison renewed our hope that one day we would get an answer, and that if we didn't, it would be okay. And there were ways for me to, keep living and managing my care without that. So after seeing her at my cardiologist appointments, I began going back to the genetics department, and opened that line of communication again. I started trying new testing and ended up trying the whole exome sequencing, as that was pretty much the end of the line at that point for me, unless I wanted to wait out the science again. And I knew how much Allison cared about me and how hard she was working to help me find a diagnosis. I will never forget the day that she finally got to tell me something different and told me that she was, so shocked she almost dropped her paperwork, that we finally found a name for the condition and we knew what it was. And she shared in that joy with us, which was just one of those moments you won't ever forget. Next slide. So working with a genetic counselor from, a patient's perspective, through everything I experienced, the relationship with your genetic counselor is unlike anything I've ever had. I've met many surgeons, many doctors, and meeting with Allison, it was different. She cared about my well-being as a whole person and not just the person from my medical records. She took the time to ask me about my life outside of the hospital and made sure also that I was seeing the right people, and just helped manage my care, letting me know if there was anybody else that I could or should be seeing, who I should be following up with. As a genetic counselor, she had to wear so many hats, more than I could ever juggle. She had to manage the genetics department stuff and then had to be a translator and try to repeat that all in English. And also just took the time to make sure I was okay with everything that I was learning, or giving me the support almost like a friend as well. And when we got the diagnosis, she brought every piece of medical literature that she could find and gave us all the information she could find about the other patients even that were out there at the time. And she answered all of our questions to the very best of her ability, which was hugely helpful to feel like there was someone that I could talk to about what I was learning. And, I knew there was someone I could go to. And she also ensured then that I knew any options I had for family planning, or for telling my family what we had found out and what that meant for them, because it would impact, or could possibly impact, my cousins or other people in my family. So they're, as a whole, extremely helpful and allow you to manage your care and how you live your life with any conditions, which you don't get anywhere else, I don't think.
That's perfect. Thanks, Melissa. What a great connection. Obviously it worked for you, but it's also so clear that when the journey is long, it makes all the difference that the person you're on the journey with is the one you want, that you feel you can succeed with. So next slide, please. We're going to be talking about genetic counselors, what they are, who is a genetic counselor, what do they do, and what do they not do. And Eleanor is going to guide us through that part. Eleanor?
Hi, I'm going to go ahead and apologize if you hear a little bit of background New York City music, which is not, it's bad luck for it to be loud at this time. So genetic counselors, sometimes there's a lot of confusion around who we are and what we do. So we are not doctors. We don't diagnose patients. Our training is different from doctors and can be really complementary. So you do want to always be followed by a doctor, sometimes multiple specialists, but often also seeing a genetic counselor can be really helpful in figuring out which specialist you should be seeing. Genetic counselor training, we have a master's degree, and it's a mix of medical genetics and counseling. And it's really personalized. So Allison gave a great overview of some genetics basics and tests, but what usually happens when people read a pamphlet or listen to a presentation is tension kind of comes and goes, and then some things stick, some things don't make sense. When you're meeting with a genetic counselor, you know, if you hear an analogy and you're like, I don't get it, that doesn't work for me, like our training is, well, we're going to explain it in a different way. So it's personalized, it's saying what lands with you. Everyone comes into a genetic counseling appointment with a different level of understanding and different concerns. If you go to the next slide, I think it's going to walk us through some of the specific things that we do in a genetic counseling session typically. And it is really different depending on the reason someone's seeking genetic counseling. So not always, but most of the time, there is discussion of testing. So in the rare disease community, often that's something people might be interested in different areas of genetic counseling. It really varies. We're not there to say you need genetic testing. That's never our role. Our role is to help you understand what your testing options are and how that testing may or may not be helpful to you, to help you understand what the likelihood is of having a result that would give you a diagnosis, and how much information that would provide, what it would not provide, and then where that information takes you. So with Melissa's case, you know, it can, depending on the disease, it might help guide which specialists you see. It might not change that. It might help specialists think about your disease in a different way. And it might just be something that really gives you an answer and validation, and that's more helpful down the road at a future date when we know more. And as Melissa alluded to, often genetic testing results have implications for other family members. So it can help if you're concerned about the risk of the same disease or something similar in other family members. It can help you understand if that's something that it makes sense for you to be concerned about, or if that might actually be a really low risk. And what that risk looks like is the range of presentation really broad. Could someone in your family or a child have something that looks really similar? Could be really quite different. So it really opens up a whole other level of discussion if that's something that you're concerned about. And then with genetic testing, there's always the possibility of getting things that we weren't really looking for, but they just kind of popped up. And so that's something that we also talk about in testing. What are the possibilities that might come up? Are you concerned about some of those? Is it something that would feel stressful? Is it something that would feel empowering? How do you manage that? So all of these things are something that we discuss in a genetic counseling appointment, and what we discuss and how much time we spend on which things is quite personalized depending on the specifics of your situation and your disease and your concerns. Next slide. And especially during COVID, telehealth is something that a lot of people have become increasingly familiar with. So yes, you can meet with a genetic counselor through telehealth. Easy-ish website URL to remember for people in the US is findageneticcounselor.com that will pull up genetic counselors in your area. There's a following slide and information in the toolkit with more related resources. Certain areas of genetic counseling especially lend themselves to telehealth, like prenatal and cancer. With rare disease, it depends, of course, but more often with rare disease and pediatric genetics, it's really helpful to have an in-person physical exam by a medical geneticist, and often a genetic counselor is going to work alongside a medical geneticist. So the spectrum of rare disease is so broad, it's impossible to make that blanket statement, but if Dana mentioned up front, I have a telehealth genetic counseling consulting company. Once in a while, I'll have someone reach out and, it's a situation where they really should be seeing an MD geneticist if possible. And so that's always something that we follow up with. But genetic counseling does lend itself really well to telehealth in general, because we don't do physical exams. We're not doctors. That's not part of our training. And it can be really helpful if you're wondering, is it worth driving 1,000 miles to see a medical geneticist, or someone's not available for 9 months, or you want some follow-up, or you already have a diagnosis, or you had negative genetic testing results, but you're wondering what would be available now. So there's certain situations where a telehealth appointment could be really beneficial and much more efficient than waiting often is the case to meet with a medical geneticist. Next slide. And this is just a snapshot from the toolkit, but I mentioned findageneticcounselor.com. That's for the US. The American Board of Genetic Counselors is a certifying body for genetic counselors. You can also search for a genetic counselor on that website. That's a good way to see in which specialty different genetic counselors practice. And it's also a good way to see or to double check if the genetic counselor you're planning to see is certified. We do sit for a board examination, and when we have licenses, genetic counselors are licensed in about half of the states. The prerequisite for that is certification. But these are some other links that are available in the toolkit that are especially helpful if you can't remember all of this, or if you're in another country also.
Perfect. Thank you, Eleanor. So once you manage to connect with a genetic counselor, if you're not familiar with the process, you're probably going to wonder what to ask, and we have a resource for that too. We'll make a link to this available. It goes through things you can ask before your appointment, at your first session, after you've gotten testing completed, basically how to approach your visit with your genetic counselor, and even some specific questions you can ask. So that's going to be one of the resources available at the end of this webinar. Next slide, please. We're going to just be a little bit more free-form discussion, group discussion with the panelists. And I know how disappointing it can be to go through testing and not get to your diagnosis. So maybe we can start off with the three of you just talking about that. What happens if you get the test, but it's not a conclusive result and it doesn't lead to a diagnosis?
I'll start out just with a comment that if you have a negative test result, you've still learned something because you've ruled some things out. So regardless of which test you had done or how broad that test was, you do have some information that's helpful. And if you have a copy, whether it's paper or electronic, of those test results, you really want to hold on to them, because for any testing that you might do in the future, your negative testing result is often a starting point. And I think sometimes people get frustrated and think, ah, it's negative, I don't even know what they tested for, but they couldn't give me an answer. But actually, it's really helpful in the future for other testing options to know what was tested for, and even for your medical management currently, potentially to know what was ruled out. That is something that's valuable.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Eleanor. I also think it's important for individuals and families to know that genetic testing is not perfect by any means. And as you saw, there are so many different types of tests, and there's more than just what I kind of skimmed through. And it can take a long time to figure out what is the genetic etiology for someone's health concerns, if we can find it at all. And that could mean years and many, many tests, or it could mean taking a break and waiting for science to improve. Every single day, we are making breakthroughs in the field of genetics, but it's important to, again, keep in mind that genetics is in its infancy compared to so many other areas of medicine. And so we have a long way to go to really understand all of what our genetic information means, as well as to analyze that information. The other thing is that you could have the most comprehensive genetic testing available. You could exhaust your options and not have an answer because of the way the information is interpreted. So one thing I forgot to mention when talking about kind of whole exome and whole genome is that it's really driven by your clinical signs and symptoms. So that's why it's important to have a physical exam from a medical geneticist or other specialist, but to also have really thorough, complete medical records. Is we're providing that information to the lab, and they're using that clinical information to help with their algorithm or help with their interpretation of the genetics. We have over 20,000 genes and billions of chemical letters that we have to look at. And so a computer is doing a lot of that. And if we leave out certain clinical information, or we don't know about certain things because they just haven't happened yet, that can limit what we find. So that's why if you have comprehensive testing, you may be told there's free reanalysis in the future, or potentially not free, depending on what lab you use. And that's always a great option, or there may be further testing available through research.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I echo what they're saying, that, you know, you should not give up if you don't have a diagnosis. I was one that had to wait out the science, and for a while I was being told there's nothing left, or you've had all of the tests. And it wasn't until, I think, Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, 2014 that the gene for my condition was found to be tied to the Ehlers-Danlos. And so all the years that I was being tested, they weren't looking at that gene. And so it was all just time that I had to wait out the science until they would be able to find my diagnosis. And so sometimes it's just patience, which is very hard to have. I can say that, but yep.
Great, and I think we could go to the next slide and then even the slide after that too. So next, we want to get into some of the myths and misunderstandings around genetic counseling and genetic testing. And I know one, just, you know, from my naivety, I would have assumed whole genome sequencing is as thorough as can be, but I guess through you guys, I've learned even that can somewhat be incomplete. So maybe that's a place to start, or if there's any number of myths you want to address, please, let's go through them.
Sure, I can just add a little bit more onto that. You know, if you take children and adults who've had whole genome sequencing, we still only identify a diagnosis about a third of the time. So that means we still have a long way to go. And that, you know, the technology is there. We have really great sequencing technology. We can analyze a lot of information really quickly, but our brains aren't there yet. We just don't know all of the genes. We don't know what all of this other DNA that's not in genes is important for. And so we have a lot of things to figure out and to really understand in a different way before we can start finding diagnoses for other individuals who may have a genetic condition that we can't find right now.
Allison had mentioned the importance of providing the clinical information to the laboratory, and that's also something that takes people spending time and people with knowledge of the laboratory, and often people discussing cases with one another. So I think sometimes there's an impression that all labs are going to be pretty much the same. And that's definitely not the case. Even two really good laboratories could come out with slightly different results because they're just looking at the information in a little bit different way. There's certain laboratory certifications that genetic counselors look for when ordering, like CLIA and CAP certifications, but that's really a starting point. And part of that is that genetic testing is not really actively regulated by the FDA, which is an area of confusion. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. But if you order a test online, it's probably not going to be a high quality test. If a doctor who doesn't have a good background in genetics orders a test for you, they might be using a lab that's great, but they might also be using a lab that if you saw a genetic counselor, they would recommend a different lab. So the lab of choice really matters. And part of that depends on certifications, part of that depends on what the lab has published, and part of it really is reputation, which shouldn't be the case, but just because we're really in an era where there's not good regulation of genetic testing, but it is a pretty small community. So reputation definitely counts. And a genetic counselor who's ordering testing for you, like someone like Allison, you're ordering whole exome sequencing, you know, it's not like once in for yourself one time in your life, like you've had experience working with companies. And so you also get a chance to see like what the track record is for different companies. She mentioned like reanalysis, like knowing if a lab would be able to do reanalysis for you in the future at no cost or added cost. So those are the kind of things that a genetic counselor would take into account when choosing a lab for you. Insurance, your insurance might be happier to cover a test through one lab or another. And then in the rare disease space, often whole exome sequencing is going to be a test that's eventually recommended. You might be moving toward whole genome sequencing, although I think currently there's not a lot of obvious value add. It's more interesting on a research basis to have whole genome sequencing done. But partly because the lab needs that clinical information to interpret the test and know where to focus, and it's such an overwhelming amount of information. A targeted test is often a better choice for certain people. So a targeted test meaning a subset of genes. So based on the clinical information you provide to a genetic counselor about your own history, family history, they might say, oh, well, let's start with looking at these genes, or let's start with a panel of testing that a lab has curated for us that specifically relates to your symptoms. And with a smaller number of genes, a lab is able to say, we're going to make sure we get really excellent information on all of these data points and take a really careful look at it. And they're really not doing that with whole exome sequencing. It's just not feasible in terms of the amount of work that would be a 20-year project.
And when you mentioned reanalysis, I'd just like to sort of underline that one. That was definitely a misunderstanding I had. So if 5 years ago I had a test and it was inconclusive, or I got a variant of unknown significance, then 5 years later, possibly at no cost, the same testing results can be re-examined and maybe produce a result. Can one of you verify me or correct me?
Yeah, so I think there's actually two questions in there. So starting with the variant of uncertain significance, a variant of uncertain significance is a change in the genetic information where we don't have enough information to know, does this change actually cause a health problem? Or is this completely normal, benign, just the version of the gene in your family and not related to any health issues at all? So one is normal and one side, it could actually impact your health. And we're just sitting in that gray area, stuck in the middle, because we don't know enough about the gene or the change. We can't necessarily model it or understand it better. And maybe other people from your ethnicity, race, ancestry haven't had enough genetic testing to know, is this normal where your family is originally from, if we went back generations. So our hope is that with that additional information collected over time, where researchers are doing studies in their labs, more and more people are having genetic testing, and just our knowledge base increases, that we'll be able to say, oh, this change actually is nothing, you don't need to worry about it, or hey, we actually have a diagnosis. And they go both ways. I've had many families go, one way where we get a diagnosis, and the other way where we're like, nope, back this starting, square, and we have to kind of rethink about what we're going to do. So that type of reanalysis for a variant of uncertain significance can be done informally. And that's one of the good ways good reasons to continue your relationship with your genetics provider, is to check in from time to time to say, is there new information? Because we're able to informally, not going through insurance, not repeating a test, just figure out, has this been reclassified and is that significant for you? On the other hand, if you have whole exome or whole genome and you do not have an answer, it's non-diagnostic, you can reanalyze that data, sometimes for free, anytime, usually after a year, because we think a year is a good amount of time for knowledge to improve. And that doesn't usually require getting a new blood sample or new saliva sample unless it's been quite a while since you had testing, because the sequencing technology is the same, it's just our interpretation is better. So you may be able to, if I ordered your test a year ago, you could call me and you could say, hey, can we do that free reanalysis? And nobody has to go to the lab, nobody has to do anything different. I just send all of your new clinical information to my friends at the lab. And we use that plus all the new science to see, is there something new that could explain your child's health concerns?
And I think you at least there, Allison, partially answered one of the questions I see in the chat, which is it possible that a VUS is contributing to the disease of someone who's had a test result with a few VUS? And that's really it. Says we don't know. So it is possible, but it's not something that that we're sure of. And I think part of the question there too is how likely is it? Which is a great question. And it can be kind of like a trap to help answer that, because we'd love to quantify our uncertainty, but we just don't know. So I think it can get kind of hard when we start saying like, oh yeah, but usually that's going to be nothing, or like usually, and like sometimes there is a little bit of information, but it just comes back to not knowing.
Great. And since Eleanor has basically taken us into the realm of Q&A, I think the next couple slides are kind of self-explanatory. We've been talking about the benefits of genetic counseling. So we'll go to our Q&A session. And that's the first one down. That was Mukti's question. Thank you for handling that, Eleanor. But Mukti actually has two questions. So the other one is, can a patient or a rare disease family from a different country collaborate with counselors in the United States? If the family is in Canada, for example, and they wanted to seek support from a counselor in the US.
Yeah, I'll take that, since I have a company that definitely can do that. So I know in Canada, the wait, I think depending on the province you're located in to see a genetic counselor can be long, which can be really frustrating. So to people in Canada, I would say stay on the wait list or get on a wait list if there is one, because depending on the situation, you do really want to see an MD geneticist most of the time when we're talking about rare disease. But yes, you can definitely see a genetic counselor. For instance, my company, telehealth, there's other telehealth companies where you're just paying out of pocket to speak with a genetic counselor. And, you know, our job is really, it's not just ordering testing, you know, and working with an MD geneticist. So it's also helping you to understand. So a lot of people have like so many different questions, you know, whether you've had testing done, you haven't had testing done. In your case, it sounds like your son did have testing done, but just to have a better understanding of those test results and to really look at test results in the context of personal and family medical history. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Great.
Oh, sorry, Daniel. I was just going to add
Allison.
on from the pediatric genetics, like traditional model standpoint. We absolutely work with families from other countries. Most major children's hospitals do. So if even if you're not a child or your child have a rare genetic condition and you know there's a specialist at a certain hospital in the United States or in another country who sees a lot of patients with that or devotes their research to it, or maybe has just seen one other family with it, if it's super rare and you want to connect with them, that is a possibility. So I work with families who are coming internationally to Lurie to see specific providers, and we coordinate with their team at home, make sure that they're getting all of the evaluations and screenings they need, and we can kind of serve as an expert who helps guide that local team.
Great. And actually, Melissa, I jumped the gun a bit. So one of the slides that I glossed over was going to be you telling us the benefits of genetic counseling from your experience. So please, why don't you tell us some of that perspective that you have on that?
Sure, yeah. So today that I can say I'm on the other side of the diagnosis journey, I can say that the genetic counseling benefits are enormous. And unlike what I did where I stopped going, I highly recommend that you continue, follow-up care, even if it's every other year or, however frequently you would like that. There's so many benefits, and science is changing so quickly that they will most likely have, new things that you can look at, new tools, new information. And as like Allison was saying, that it's good to just check in and see if anything with yourself has changed. And I would highlight again that they, can help coordinate your care and help you figure out if there's anything or anyone that you should be seeing to help manage any symptoms, and that they're there for you even after your diagnosis, which I found that a lot of people didn't know just in friends and family. A lot of people seem to think that it was a one and done. You go and you don't find an answer, or you do and then you don't go back. So I would definitely highlight that, they're there after your diagnosis too. And I don't know, for me, I want to highlight that finding the diagnosis meant, I got connection with others, and knowledge is absolutely power. And it gave me the feeling of empowerment to know, how I could manage my care. Not that it even changed much for me, but just that I felt more confident. And I was able to find, because I had a name for my condition then, I was able to find now 10 other families that have the same condition. And a lot of the families have really young kids. And so now I'm seeing it from, a parent perspective of what my mom went through. And unfortunately, I can say I'm older than Google. So my mom didn't have all this information at her fingertips. And seeing these moms and dads have a question and they're able to quickly get an answer from 5-10 different people, and for them, that reassurance of, this is quote unquote normal for us, or they're able to get some kind of reassurance of what the future might look for them, which even if it's not a guarantee, there's definitely a feeling of peace, it seems like, with even thinking they know what could be in their future. Because a lot of what I went through when I was younger, I was very delayed in a lot of major physical milestones. So I didn't learn to walk until I was almost 4. And so some of these parents were asking me right away, is my kid ever going to start crawling or walking? And I didn't have a guarantee, but given what I'm seeing with some of these other families, we all could say probably, and you just have to wait a few more years. And so giving them that sense of, empowerment too, that they have information nearby. It's a blessing, and I feel really grateful to be in this position and to have this diagnosis, which sounds funny. And I did get to meet one of the girls a year or two ago, and I can't tell you for the first time in my life how that felt to actually see someone else that looked like me. And I, in 25 years, had never met anyone like me. It's one of those moments that you just remember forever, because I don't know, it gives me chills. And much as I would talk about, that I found joy in all of this in my diagnosis, I don't want to negate not finding it, the diagnosis. So if you're on that side of it, I would just say to keep having hope and keep seeing your genetic counselor.
I can completely relate to your chills. If nothing else, as bad as the diagnosis may be, it gets you in the position to connect with other people that know more about what you're going through or can relate to what you're going through. And that seems in and of itself probably a major comfort. The next question that's come in, it was submitted even before we started tonight. Why don't physicians order whole genome sequencing in the beginning in order to get a faster diagnosis? Anyone?
I can try. So whole genome is a very new test available clinically, and I can say, it's different at every institution. But at my own institution, we just started in 2021 ordering whole genomes on a clinical basis, so not research. And we've sent, a handful, and they're for generally critically ill patients. So of any age, but critically ill, who are in the hospital. And we feel like this is our absolute best chance to find something that could change their immediate care. I think we are certainly moving towards a change in testing practices where we are going to start with broader, more comprehensive testing. But that means we have to get buy-in from families. We have to get buy-in from our institutions. We have to get buy-in from insurance companies. We have to be able to show that these tests are worth ordering because they're incredibly expensive and they take a lot of resources to do. So the traditional model is still, at least in pediatric genetics, where we start oftentimes with something like a chromosome microarray if we're not quite sure what's going on and there's multiple body systems. And then we move on to broader testing like whole exome. And if you're seeing me in an outpatient clinic, we're probably talking about research whole genome if you don't have a diagnosis. But ask me in a year and I think the conversation will be very different.
Great, thank you. So another submitted question is, should genetic test results be sent directly to the patients, either through email or some electronic forms?
Eleanor, do you want to, I know you already talked about that, so you want to talk about it again?
Yeah, well, I'll say some of my thoughts and you can fill in. So I'm kind of tripping over the word should. So there's a lot of hoops that we have to jump through, mostly in a good way with HIPAA. So often your test results are going to be available through a HIPAA compliant portal like that the hospital has, or many labs that we order through also have a patient portal. So you might be able to access your test results directly through that patient portal. Which kind of gets around this email issue, hopefully for many people, because you can just log in securely with your email instead of getting them sent to your email. My company, because we're a smaller company, we don't have anything like a portal, but we use a third-party encrypted email service to send that information back and forth. But it's also, it's so up to patients. Privacy really matters, but some people are especially concerned about that. And a patient might say, please just email it to me without encryption. I can't order the other one. It's too difficult. And I think at my company, we can do that. And we'll note that was your preference and you were okay with that. I don't know if Allison can comment on her institution. Different institutions might have different policies and interpretations of HIPAA. But I guess in handling our patients' test results, we try to be really careful about privacy, but that does come up against convenience sometimes. Like with if you're wanting to share test results with family members, I'm like, if you're fine with it, text it to them, however they're going to get it, if you're okay with that. Because that definitely, it does make it harder to get test results, even though that's part of the point.
Yeah, I think, once you have a copy of your test report, what you do with it is up to you. But certainly getting it to patients can be challenging. So, we are no longer allowed to email results, even encrypted, to patients, which used to be my standard go-to, because I would send you a nice PDF so you had it for your records. But at the same time, not all of my patients have email access, have computer access. So then it might be providing a paper copy of their results so they can file those at home. Maybe the result isn't in the language that they speak and read. So we have a lot of barriers to reports, but the easiest thing to do is to share it through the secure portal. So I'm able to share results through my chart as an attachment. We're still trying to work out, like, how do you get external labs to, like, genetic testing to show up in your MyChart in a really user-friendly way. I also think the flip side of this question is, you should get your result from the person who ordered your test, like your genetic counselor, your provider, and then you should get a copy of the result, because it can be really challenging to read and interpret these reports if you do not have the training to. They are very confusing. There can be a lot of variants of uncertain significance. There could be incidental findings. There could be things on the report that, if interpreted incorrectly, could be very detrimental. So I do encourage you to have that conversation and don't just read your report, but actually receive the appropriate counseling to go with it to understand what does this mean for you or your child.
Great. Next question is, what do you look for when assessing where to get your diagnostic testing done?
I'll give it, wait, go ahead, Allison.
I was just gonna say it depends on the patient. So if you are seeing multiple specialists at one institution already, it makes the most sense to go to the genetics provider at that institution because they have really great access to all of your records. However, the electronic medical record is changing that. So, because I'm at a freestanding children's hospital, I see patients who are receiving their care all over Illinois, but also all over the Midwest, and sometimes coming from international or other states in the country. And we're able to get good records. And we're able to request paper copies if we need them. So certainly I think starting at your institution is a great idea. And I can let Eleanor talk about if there are barriers to that and alternatives. But I have a lot of patients who have a rare diagnosis and maybe I've seen a couple patients with it, or maybe they're the first patient I've ever seen with it, but I know that there's a genetics provider at another children's hospital who devotes their career to it, who researches it, who has a specialty clinic. I'm going to want to get them there. And so you should ask, you can start wherever, but then ask, where should I go from here?
Yeah, I'm glad you answered that because I've read the question very differently and was thinking about lab choice, which I think we already addressed. Yeah, and often start local, like Allison said. If there's someone near you, you can see. If there's not, telehealth can be an option to start. But then, depending on the area, there might be someone who has like decades of experience and is really published on it, and something's like quite rare and like. That's the, often we're talking about an MD geneticist, like that's the MD geneticist you want to see, not the one who has in principle the same training, but doesn't have the same experience and expertise in the specifics related to your possible conditions.
So I read the question the same way you did, Eleanor, that it was about labs. So I thought I'd stay out of that one. But so just a quick note that the one family that I met that had the same thing I did, they did kind of what you guys were talking about, and also, but they had tried to see people in Texas, and nobody knew what we had, and there was no experience. And so then the family drove to Chicago actually and met with the team there, and then that's how I ended up getting to meet her in person too, which was really cool.
Yes, Melissa surprised me at her appointment. I walked in the room and there she was with her mom, and it was really amazing to see both families. But I mean, that's just a great example. And now she travels, we see her by telemedicine as well. And sometimes she comes in person, and we're able to provide really customized care for her team back in Texas that is coming from people who we're not experts, but we've seen now at least one other patient who has the same thing. We learned a lot from Melissa's care, and we have a clinic that really focuses on the vascular aspects of connective tissue disorders, and so we're trying to, even though there's no guidelines, provide guidance for her care to keep her healthy.
Great. Our next question, someone is curious how a nonprofit for rare diseases can support their community in learning more and making connections to genetic counselors. Other than what we're doing right here, right now, I guess.
Daniel, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah. Well, I would say, when we share all these resources with you tonight, you should be sharing them back to your communities. So that's part of the answer, I'm sure. Oh, and I'll use it as a springboard. What we're going to mention before we conclude tonight is we have the rare disease toolkits on these topics, and we have this webinar series on these topics. And then we have this community, and online, it's new. We're calling it the Rare Portal. And it's like many of you have used a closed Facebook group, probably particular to your rare disease, because Global Genes is an umbrella organization about all rare diseases, so is our community, right? So at our broadest, we are all things rare disease in these community conversations. So as long as it's about rare disease, go ahead and share, and maybe someone will have an answer for you. But then within that, we have these niche silos of content, and one of them is we call GBDX, getting to gene-based diagnosis. So the same kind of conversation we're having now, we can continue if you join the Rare portal. There's a page under browse and GBDX, and that will give you all these type of topics that people are talking about, and you can post your own, you can answer someone else's. And so it's just a way to keep the conversation going and collect all the resources in one easy place. So that might be part of the answer to the question. But if you have other thoughts on how not-for-profits that are concerned with rare disease can make better connection, better learning opportunities to genetic counselors.
I think just reaching out to genetics providers can be really powerful. So I'm only going to speak for myself and not the genetic counseling community, but the part of my job I enjoy the most is working with families. And I have never said no to an invitation from a rare disease organization to speak, to do a webinar or just a small meetup like with other families, just to provide some basic genetics education or talk about upcoming potential therapies, anything that we can do to support them. I'm happy to do, and I know a lot of my colleagues feel very similarly and enjoy being involved in the support organizations that are specific to a lot of the conditions that they work with. So sometimes just asking your care team if they're interested in being involved or could provide any information is a good place to start.
Great. Our next question is, who will the information from the genetic testing be shared with? I assume means which members of the medical team, but I guess it's privacy concerns, right?
Yeah, Allison, maybe you'll be better at answering this one, but it goes in your medical record, which at this point it's all electronic. And there, it's true. I think some people worry that so many different people potentially have access to the electronic medical record. Maybe I'm interpreting too much where that might be coming from. Healthcare providers are only supposed to access results for patients that they see. So it is something that typically like your genetic counselor would see, your primary care physician would see, other specialists would see. I think usually the issue is who doesn't see it, not who does see it. Genetic physicians should have access, but as Allison mentioned, sometimes it's a challenge to get genetic testing results in the medical record in a way that's reader friendly. So if you were let's say you had testing done, it's in the medical record, you're seeing a physician within that system, probably don't want to assume that they've definitely reviewed those results, because it might be somewhere that's not very user friendly in the chart. And if you're calling to make an appointment with a specialist, ideally in advance, let them know there are genetic results in there, let them know at the beginning of the appointment, because if it's someone without a genetics background and they haven't looked at it, they're probably going to be a little confused and wish that they called Allison first to discuss the results. But it's treated the way the rest of your healthcare information and test results are, essentially.
Yeah, so for the way that we practice is that, your referring provider and your pediatrician, whether or not they're the same person, should receive a copy of the report, or at least our letter that explains the report and has recommendations and our care plan in it. And you will receive that as well. And by you, I mean the patient and or their guardian, but nobody else is allowed to access that information without written consent. So your sibling can't call up and ask for it. Your parent can't call up and ask for it, again, unless they're your legal guardian or you're under 18. So we can't just pick up a phone call from somebody and share information without that consent. And then I like it when families tell me specifically, like, hey, can you make sure that this result gets to this person and this person and this person, even though they're not the referring provider. I want to make sure that they're aware. And so then I will absolutely send a letter, send them a message, forward a documentation of our phone call so that they have kind of the basic outline and can call me if they have questions. But anybody that I refer you to, so if we get a new diagnosis and I'm giving you a list of things we need to do now, that individual is going to get information from us that explains, why is this important? Why are they coming to see you? What are we looking for? And that's really important. So if they're not doing that, you should ask for that.
Yeah, and that gets us very nicely into this next question, which I think deals with sort of how patients manage the roles of the different people on their care team. So the question is, does your doctor work with the genetic counselor directly, or does the patient have to be the link between the two? And I think you were just talking about some of that information flow, but maybe if we can break down that working relationship a little bit.
So because I'm a pediatric genetic counselor, I work in that traditional model where I see patients usually with a physician. So either a medical geneticist or a physician who specializes in a certain group of disorders. Part of my job is working with endogenetics, so genetic conditions that impact hormones in the body. And so in that situation, I'm not working with a geneticist, I'm working with an endocrinologist. And we partner together. But if I saw a patient in genetics who needed to partner with someone in another division, again, we need to have a kind of a more formal conversation about that to loop them in if it's not kind of obvious to me. So if you as the parent or patient say, like, I really need this doctor to be aware, I want you to tell me. But at least in our model, I see my patients with a physician. Eleanor's model is different.
Yeah, I think it's really institution specific, and ideal is a multidisciplinary care model, and that doesn't exist everywhere. And then ideally genetic counselors are integrated into a team. So a company like mine, it's just a company of genetic counselors, it's all telehealth. So we're not connected to any hospitals specifically. Sometimes we contract with different institutions. So then we'd have referrals coming from them, and there might be specific to how that group manages it. There might be more communication with the doctors, but if you go to our website and you book an appointment, we're going to ask you for your records because we don't have them from your doctor. We don't have access to those. And then we're going to send you a consult note, and you need to share that with your doctor. And then we're available to speak with your doctor if your doctor has questions. But we don't call them or chase them. Generally, calling doctors is pretty inefficient way of trying to get a hold of them. So in a case like ours, like the onus is really on the patient to do that work. And that is one reason that, multidisciplinary care model can be really valuable, is that you don't have to do all that work of connecting.
Great. I want to mention for anyone who's watching right now, we are using both the questions you type in, real time with us and the questions that were submitted in advance. So don't hesitate to add more questions as we work through some of the ones that we got ahead of time. We definitely will get to any that pop up in our Q&A text box there. So this one sounds perfect for Melissa. Takes a lot of courage to share a rare disease story. How has sharing your story helped you?
Oh gosh, sharing for me, it's just been, I guess exciting that I've been able to find other people like me, and to be able to help other people makes this seem worth it. I spent so many years knowing nothing and being overly frustrated, and then finally getting the diagnosis. This wouldn't be for everybody, but for me personally, I had already been managing all of the symptoms, that it didn't really change any care. And at this point, they don't know anything that I know of, Allison. I don't know that of what my future would look like or what, if anything's different. But it allowed me to, reach out to other people, and I don't know, it just gave me the power to be able to help share the information, and it may change your care, you know, depending on what the results are. But I don't know. I'm kind of circling the drain. I don't know if anybody else has any comments, but I think it just, yeah, I'm doing good. I loved getting to meet other people and being able to talk to them and hearing other people's stories then. And yeah, that's all I got. Sorry, guys.
No, I think that's a great answer. It's very similar to how I would answer it. I think until, obviously not everyone's comfortable sharing their story, but until you do, I think you have more of the isolation, more of the feeling of being alone. And once you do, you're not even sure who you find. You might find someone with the exact same condition, or just someone who relates to your experience in a broader way. But either way, my experience has been the people that find you because you put your story out there are amazing resources. They become, for me, they've become great friends, sometimes partners, sometimes they've offered the next piece of the puzzle I was trying to solve. So acknowledging that not everyone feels comfortable doing it, I recommend everybody does it. All right. Let's see. This one I think is probably so broad that you might not have a very clear answer to, but how often should I meet with my genetic counselor?
Depends. I think that's a very individual question. You know, if you have a diagnosis and you are seeing all of the providers you need to see, and the genetic counselor is not necessarily a part of that care team, then you're going to want to check in at major time points. So if it's your child who has the condition, starting out with just time points when they're ready to learn more about their diagnosis. So for education, whether that's around middle school, definitely in their high school years, definitely when they're thinking about family planning, if that's something they want to do. If you're an adult, it's really just up to you. Like, you can check in when you'd like to say, is there anything new? Is there anything that you think I should know? Or when you're family planning, when your siblings are family planning. If you don't have a diagnosis, keep that connection open, because it's important to stay up to date on it. Are there new testing available? You know, are we up for reanalysis? Kind of what are our options moving forward? So, you know, the relationship doesn't just stop because you finished a test. We're here for you to answer questions. You can pick up the phone, you can send us a message, and we'll do our best to figure out, you know, when is the right time for you to come back. And you know, for me, a lot of the time that means coming back to clinic and seeing, you know, a provider or a team of providers, and I'm on that team. And so it's just a piece of your yearly follow-up or your every other year follow-up, or, you know, you could be coming in every 3 months, just depends on what's going on. So we just have to make it custom to you and your family based on your needs and where you're at in your journey.
Yeah, and I would just say that's a really good question for your genetic counselor when you see them for the first time. And if you've already seen a genetic counselor, hopefully you kept a copy of the consult note that they wrote for you, the answer might be in that consult note toward the end in recommendations. They might have specifically recommended how often or if you should follow up.
Yeah, I know from my experience, and it may have been the fog of bad news on diagnosis day where you can only hear so much, but I had no idea that we could have had more than one visit with our genetic counselor. Probably would have been of benefit if we did, but we took the information and went home with it and tried to digest it. And that was the end of because of us, that was the end of the relationship. I just didn't know that it could have been recurring. Or
Daniel, I'm really glad you said that, because I give a lot of bad news. I sometimes consider myself a professional bad news giver. You know, not all genetic test results are happy genetic test results. It's not always a nice, pretty bow that wraps everything up and you get an explanation for what's going on. And regardless of what information I'm giving, it can be really overwhelming. And you might only remember 3 things out of our hour-long conversation or 2-hour-long conversation. We could really have a lot to go through. And I don't expect you to remember everything. I expect you to call with questions, to send questions through my chart so that we can set up additional phone calls, additional appointments to make sure that you're digesting it at an appropriate rate for you and based on what's going on in your family.
I don't know if it's standard practice, but your all your meeting rooms include the tissue box. Is that a standard genetic counselor trick?
They do, but sometimes I get to give really good news, which is great too. And it's just sometimes genetic diagnoses are a really great thing, and sometimes it's we learn really unfortunate information when we get a genetic diagnosis, and sometimes we're having a mix of emotions. You can be happy and sad about a result at the same time. You can be worried, but also just feel relief at the same time. Like, that's normal.
I for sure everything on that day, Allison. And so for sure being able to just reach out and email or, call. And then when I followed up, when my family had questions, it's definitely helpful, and that you can follow up really whenever.
Mm-hmm. And for Melissa, transitioning to adult care, I think was also really important, was just making sure that her adult care team had all of our recommendations and could follow that plan. And thankfully, we have a really great partner adult clinic at Northwestern. So she's in fantastic hands, but I have now the pleasure of being friends with Melissa through all of the advocacy work that we've been doing together, primarily through Global Genes.
Mm-hmm.
So Mirabelle has a question. Do insurance companies challenge the need for genetic testing?
Yes. So maybe I'll answer, and then Eleanor, you can answer about how you do things. So I work at a pediatric hospital. We have to get insurance prior authorization prior to sending testing. We have, I would say, 1/3 to 40% of our patients are Medicaid. So we have to provide equitable care. So we obtain insurance prior authorization, which is just a request to the insurance company to figure out, is this a covered benefit or not? And we get a lot of denials. We provide really detailed long letters and clinical notes explaining why it's medically necessary, and we still get a lot of denials. And we appeal them. We do peer-to-peer phone calls. We do everything in our power to try to get things approved. But sometimes plans have exclusions or they just don't accept your appeal, and we can't get things approved.
I did hear. Go ahead, Eleanor.
I don't have too much to add. With my telehealth setting, we're not ordering a lot of like whole exome testing or things that would be relevant to people with rare disease. I'll say, with a subset, in case it's relevant to someone, if you have a family history of cancer, often that testing, hereditary cancer testing, is better covered than people suspect. It depends on the insurance, but often that is covered, and that's a misconception that would fit into our misconceptions among patients and also physicians. Is there's an assumption sometimes like, oh, well, this will never be covered, or this is really expensive. And also increasingly when insurance won't cover testing, the out-of-pocket cost over the past 5 years has dropped so much. So, out-of-pocket for exome, of course, is still going to be very expensive, but for like a targeted panel of testing, like related to cancer, but also if you meet with a genetic counselor, it might be like, okay, well, we can't get insurance coverage right now for whole exome, or it's going to take a while, we're going to work on it, but you have a lot of symptoms related to specific genes here that fall under this one disease category, and it might be possible to order testing for you for $250 out of pocket. So for some people that's completely unaffordable, but for some people it's like life-changing kind of, and like maybe the answer is just in there. And then again, if you have a negative result, well, you've ruled something out.
And
you shouldn't let cost prevent you from going to a genetics appointment, because we as genetic counselors are going to do everything we can to support you figuring out is this the right testing for you? And cost is one of those factors. I can't look at an insurance and know what they're going to say. I've been surprised on both directions, whether it's covered or not covered. And like Eleanor just said, there's so many resources available for affordable out-of-pocket self-pay testing that some families can go that route.
Yeah, and I've heard, just recently learned that sometimes if you're able to go out of pocket and take on that expense, and then the result leads to a diagnosis, you might go back to the insurance company and find it is covered because it was definitive. So you're taking your chances, I suppose, but there's a chance of being reimbursed. Is that something you've encountered? Does that sometimes happen?
That can happen. So if you have something that is denied, you can always appeal when it's done. However, I will just give the caveat of that scenario you just described is not something that, like, at my institution, I would assist with. I'm happy to provide things to the family, a letter of support, medical documentation, but I can't do the submission. They have to do it because they're the representative.
Great. I think this will probably be our last question. Can you do a group family session with a genetic counselor? I assume we mean a family larger than sort of the, if it's a pediatric and parent, we're looking at maybe, a family of 3 or more. Yeah, I guess for probably the gist of the question might be about if there are going to be implications for other members of the family, right? Maybe for family planning or that kind of, or.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can be creative. Like, I see a lot of sibships, a lot of sibling, groups. I have some families where I'm seeing 3 kids at once and they all come together for their appointments. But it's not unusual pre-COVID for grandparents, aunts, uncles to come to visits with the parents and the child, or with the adult. Maybe they're accompanied by a sibling or their parent, because in some situations, genetics does impact the rest of the family, but sometimes genetic conditions are brand new in the individual and there aren't implications for the rest of the family. So it's important to know, if you do have a genetic diagnosis, is there a risk and what is it? But we're willing to help in however we can. And I had a diagnosis for one family and I gave my information, and then I was contacted by the aunts and uncles, the grandparents, the granduncles and aunts and their children. And I have some families where I've worked with many, many generations. We just do our own separate consultations.
Great. I think that was a lot of good information for people. I hope we got to everybody's questions that wanted to ask. Thank you all again. I mentioned earlier, one of the purposes of this program, or the ways this program is meant to keep everyone informed, is through our Rare portal. And following this webinar, you'll get an email with links to some of the various resources. And one of them will be how you can request your access to the Rare portal. So you'll follow the link and you'll say, I want to join the Rare portal, and then we'll send you the instructions. And that's on the right side is a bit of a screenshot. Happens to be a cute boy's story of how he got, I think it was whole genome sequencing to get his diagnosis in a fairly quick amount of time. But anyway, there are a number of great resources on the portal. We hope to see a lot of you there having conversations, asking and answering questions. We all know, I think, that sharing our experiences is what helps us all, move closer to either better information or possibly advancing our efforts towards treatments and cures and testing. And obviously, more information from more people is always a benefit, and that's what we're trying to create in the Rare portal community. Next slide, please. You might see that pop up on social media, just an invitation to go to our new Rare portal. And for anyone that that might have enjoyed this webinar but wasn't able to make it, we are going to make the recording available, and we'll send that link out soon too. So you can share it with anybody you think needed to be here for this. And also, next slide, please. Those links we're sending out are going to include the 2 new toolkits and the comparison chart for different genetic tests and the sample starter questions that you can ask a genetic counselor. So thank you all, panelists, Allison, Eleanor, Melissa, and all of you who joined us in the audience to listen to this session. Hope it was helpful. I know I could have benefited, things you wish you knew a long time ago. Well, in my case, it was a long time ago. But hopefully some of you are kind of early stages, or you can refer people that are early stages and they need this kind of information. Tell them about it, send them the links. Thank you all again. It was great having you join us. And the next one is on the 17th. And then there's another one on the 31st. And we hope you'll join us for all of those. Until then, join us in the portal. We'll talk to you soon.